Before the golden age of superheroes began in 1938 with the introduction of Superman, we had heroes who were super in all but name, such as the Shadow or Doc Savage, who appeared in pulp magazines and novels. Of course, a hero is only as good as their villains. I'm Andrew Boyd, and today on Top 10 Nerd we will be looking at the top 10 villains from the past you've never heard of. Number 10. Fu Manchu. This villain is more remembered for the facial hair he inspired and for being an incredibly offensive stereotype than he is for his fictional acts of villainy. Fu Manchu was created all the way back in 1912 by an English author named Sax Rohmer after he asked a Ouija board how he would make his fortune, and I swear this is true, the board spelled out a racial slur that inspired him to come up with the character. Dr. Fu Manchu has studied at various universities and has 4 doctorates. He is a crime boss who uses members of various secret societies as his enforcers, as well as various dangerous exotic animals like cobras and spiders to attack his enemies. His goal is to take over the world so that he can restore China to its former glory. He has a daughter named Falo Sui who is frequently trying to usurp him by teaming up with the heroes who are trying to defeat him. He is most frequently paired against the heroes of the novels, Dennis Nayland Smith and Dr. Petrie. He is one of the first supervillains in fiction, but his legacy is far overshadowed by the fact that he is directly responsible for starting the yellow panic trope in fiction, where Asian characters began being consistently written as plotting and dangerous masterminds trying to bring down the white man. He has had a permanent impact on fiction as a result, inspiring other dicey characters like Marvel's The Mandarin. Number 9. The Fly. The problem with having heroes who kill their villains is that you don't get many recurring enemies as a result. This is especially true for the pulp hero known as the Spider, who is a millionaire who dresses up in a disguise and brutally murders his opponents. He is a character known for his bloodlust, kind of like the Punisher of his time, but one of the few villains who managed to give the Spider any repeated trouble was the Fly. First appearing in the August 1934 issue of Spider magazine in the story Prince of the Red Looters, the Fly is also a wealthy playboy who has become bored and decides to take up crime as a hobby. At the story's start he has killed 4 men and stolen $50,000. Despite most of the criminal underworld being terrified of the Spider, the Fly places an ad in the paper with an invitation saying, "Won't you come into my parlor?" The two meet and the Fly challenges the Spider to a sword fight. The 2 men are evenly matched and the Fly eventually pulls a gun, but being the sporting type he doesn't kill him and instead ties the Spider up and leaves him for the police. The Fly goes on to rob a bank, leaving a massive trail of carnage in his wake. He is smart enough to deduce that the Spider is really Richard Wentworth and makes several assassination attempts on him. He sends his stolen goods in the mail to the various gangsters of the city in order to earn their support and uses his newfound syndicate to rob several banks across the city. By the end of the story, the Spider and the Fly engage in another sword fight that seems to end with the Fly's death, but in a move that was highly unusual in the Spider magazine, he returned a year and a half later in the story Green Globes of Death, where he developed gas weapons that caused his victims to bleed from every pore. As I mentioned in my hero version of this video, Spider stories were incredibly violent, with death tolls routinely going into the thousands by the end of each book. Number 8. Voodoo Master. One of the recurring foes of the Shadow is Dr. Rodil McQuino, who has hypnotic powers that he has attained through the use of black magic, which allow him to take control of people's minds and make them a part of his mindless zombie-like horde. He used these abilities to come to New York and start a cult, which he used to attain wealth. This brought him into conflict with the Shadow, who shot him and presumed him dead. Unfortunately, Voodoo Master returned and began an experiment which he planned to run on the entire human race. He planned to gain a massive amount of followers in the United States, but felt that the machine age was making this more difficult to accomplish. So, once he settled in the town of Hampstead and began enacting his scheme, he also began destroying the city's various factories. The Voodoo Master made 3 appearances in the original Shadow magazine stories before being permanently killed off, but he is also a recurring character in the Dynamite Entertainment comic book series featuring the Shadow. Number 7. The Sky Band. The Sky Band are a gang of villains who battle the pulp hero known as the Phantom in several stories throughout the character's history. The Sky Band are an all-female group of sky pirates who terrorize the air. They are led by a woman named the Baroness, who has an unrequited love for the Phantom despite them being on opposite sides of the law. Another member of the gang, named Sala, is also in love with the Phantom, and frequently comes into contact and/or conflict with the hero many times throughout his storied history, and once the Baroness dies in her first appearance, Sala takes over the gang. They are a mainstay of the Phantom mythology, appearing in the original comic strips, the comic books published by Gold Key, Charlton, DC, Marvel, Moonstone, and Dynamite Comics. They also appeared in an episode of the Defenders of the Earth cartoon, which featured the Phantom fighting alongside Mandrake the Magician and Flash Gordon in space, although in this version they were of course space pirates. Their most notable appearance is probably in the 1996 movie starring Billy Zane, where Sala was played by Catherine Zeta-Jones. Number 6. Dr. Death. There are actually two Dr. Deaths. The first one was a recurring villain of a rather boring hero named Nibs Holloway, who was a troubleshooter for a jewelry company. This Dr. Death was an international criminal who of course stole jewelry. He died at the end of his first appearance, but due to reader interest was brought back for a second story. He died again, before being resurrected for one more time for a fourth and final story. The character proved more popular than the hero, in being that it was difficult to come up with scenarios where a jewelry store troubleshooter would come into conflict with an over-the-top supervillain. A new Dr. Death was created and given his own book. The new Dr. Death was a mad scientist named Dr. Rance Mandarin, who used to be the Dean of Psychology at Yale before he lost his mind and decided that he would use both scientific and occult methods to kill as many people as possible, believing that the world was becoming overpopulated. His enemy was a supernatural detective named Jimmy Holm, who would stop all the Doctor's plans and eventually marry his niece, Nina. Number 5. Ming the Merciless. When the Earth was bombarded by a series of meteors, Dr. Hans Zarkov built a spaceship to locate the meteor's planet of origin. He set off to space with a woman named Dale Arden and a man named Flash Gordon in tow. They traveled to the planet Mongo, which they discovered was being ruled by an evil emperor named Ming the Merciless. Ming immediately wanted to marry Dale and forced Flash to fight in his gladiatorial battle arena. He became a staple of the Flash Gordon mythos and has appeared in every subsequent version of the series, from the original 1934 comic strips to the subsequent film serials of 1936, 38, and 1940. He went up against Flash and the gang again in the 1979 and 1996 animated series, as well as the 1986 Defenders of the Earth series and a 2007 live-action series for the Sci-Fi Channel. Although he is perhaps most well known to modern audiences for his appearance in the 1980 feature film where he was played by Max von Sydow. He has a bit of a complicated legacy, as he is clearly inspired by negative Asian stereotypes like Fu Manchu, but since he's technically an alien, this issue has been avoided in certain adaptations by making him a generic white dude in the 2007 series, or a green reptilian alien in the Defenders of the Earth series. Number 4. Shiwan Khan. Alright, this is the last of the Yellow Peril style villains on this list. The Shadow's arch nemesis, Shiwan Khan, has a kinda funny backstory, as in the pulp novels he is said to be the last living descendant of Genghis Khan. Of course, due to DNA testing, we now know that Genghis Khan had so many children that 1 in 200 people alive today are descended from him. But let's go with it. Shiwan is intent on living up to his ancestors' legacy by conquering as much of the world as possible. He operated out of the lost city of Xanadu, where he was trained by Tibetan monks who taught him how to harness his telepathic powers and become invisible, clairvoyant, and how to control the dead. Shiwan Khan is far and away the most often recurring shadow villain, appearing in pulp stories The Golden Master, Shiwan Khan Returns, The Invincible Shiwan Khan, and Masters of Death. He's also appeared at some point in every subsequent comic book iteration of the Shadow, including those published by Archie Comics, DC Comics, Dark Horse Comics, and Dynamite Entertainment. He's also the main antagonist of the 1994 live-action Alec Baldwin starring Shadow movie. Number 3. John Sunlight. Doc Savage, the Man of Bronze, who has an Arctic headquarters called the Fortress of Solitude and whose first name is Clark, is an obvious source of inspiration for Superman. Although he doesn't have actual superpowers and was instead trained from birth to be an expert in almost every field and to achieve peak human condition. He is an incredibly effective pulp hero, and as a result never really had many repeat villains other than John Sunlight, who managed to survive his first encounter with Doc Savage only to be killed in his second appearance. John Sunlight is the only character who can match Savage in intelligence and even overcome him in strength. As a result, the two have an immense respect for each other, even if they are enemies. He has the ability to hypnotize all but the most intelligent of men, and his goal is to end world hunger, war, and intolerance. Unfortunately, he wants to do this by becoming the ruler of the world, so this doesn't really gel with Savage's goals. In the first story, The Fortress of Solitude, he escaped from an Arctic Russian prison before he came across Doc's fortress, which was filled with Savage's most deadly inventions. He began selling these weapons to rival armies who were at war. At the end of this adventure, Savage came across remains that seemed to imply that Sunlight had been eaten by a polar bear, but it was actually Sunlight who ended the bear and went on to try and get his revenge on Savage in the story The Devil Genghis, where the hypnotized masses turned on him and tore him limb from limb. The character has appeared in the years since in several of the various Doc Savage comic books that have come out in the years since. Number 2. Dr. Satan. Weird Tales magazine is best known for publishing the stories of authors like Seabury Quinn and H.P. Lovecraft. And though they did publish a few recurring characters, they didn't really go in for the hero or villain pulps that would one day evolve into the superheroes we know today. However, they did have one hero and villain pair that they would publish 8 adventures of between 1933 and 1934. The hero was an occult detective named Ascot Keene, but it was the more colorful villain who received top billing. Dr. Satan. Dr. Satan would use occult magic in order to enact criminal schemes, such as causing plants to grow out of men's skulls and reanimating dead bodies to pose as kidnap victims in order to extort people for money. Although we never learned his true identity, we did learn that he is actually just a rich playboy who learned magic and turned to crime out of boredom. This character has fallen into the public domain, so you could make your own Dr. Satan stories and no one could stop you. Number 1. Superman. Fans of the Man of Steel may know that Superman was created by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster and first appeared in Action Comics number 1 in 1938, before taking the world by storm and becoming one of the most enduring and iconic pop culture icons of all time. What not everyone is aware of is that Clark Kent was not the first Superman that Siegel and Shuster created. In 1933, 5 years before Action Comics number 1, the pair published a short story in issue 3 of the fanzine Science Fiction: The Advance Guard of Future Civilization, under the pseudonym of Herbert S. Fine. The character was a poor, bald man named Bill Dunn who was in a bread line before being selected by a scientist to be the subject of an experiment. The chemicals that the professor made Bill ingest granted him telepathic powers and he killed the scientist. This Superman decides to use his powers to conquer the world, but soon discovers that the effects of the potion are temporary, and without the scientist, he will soon be a poor nobody on the breadlines once again. Siegel and Shuster would end up reusing the name when they created their more famous character, but the two would eventually introduce another bald villain for the new Superman to fight. Any other pulp characters you want to know about? Let us know in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe for more Top 10 Nerd.